I want to invite you to open up to Acts chapter 18. Acts chapter 18. I want to thank Michael for all the work he did in putting that great lesson together last week. Paul was in Athens, really pivotal part of the story of Acts. And we're going to continue. Paul is in his second missionary journey, and he's going to find himself in the city of Corinth today. And so again, if you'd like to turn over to Acts chapter 18, that's where we're going to be taking the lesson from this morning. And just a reminder, start with this map that we've been using from week to week, kind of give you an idea of where in the world Paul is traveling right now. So he is gone from Macedonia up in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, places like Philippi and Thessalonica, traveled south through Berea, and now he's down in Achaia, that green section. He was in Athens, and now he's in Corinth. His Athens stop was not very long, met with mixed reception and some opposition that he had to overcome in that city, but God was at work through him, and the gospel was planted. Now he's on his way to the city of Corinth. And so we're going to pick up in Acts chapter 18, starting in verse 1, and we're going to be introduced to one of the many characters we find along the way in the journey through Acts. Acts is really kind of two halves of the same story of the early church. In the first half of the book, we spend most of our time primarily talking about the apostles working out of the city of Jerusalem. And then as Jesus promised, the gospel was going to spread from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria, and then even to the ends of the earth. In chapter 9, we are introduced to Saul, who is converted on his way to Damascus. And from that point on, we've got a new character in the story. And really from chapter 14 onward, Luke really focuses almost entirely on Luke and what God is, on Paul and what God is doing through the apostle Paul. But it's easy to forget along the way that the spread of the gospel is not happening in a vacuum. It's not just Jesus and Paul taking on the world. There's people spreading the gospel all over the place. And so while he focuses primarily on the work of Paul, we are introduced to these other characters: Barnabas, John Mark, Saul, Timothy, Titus eventually. But here it's Priscilla and Aquila, a husband and wife team. And we're introduced to them, and they become very important players in the spread of the gospel. And we'll look at a couple passages beyond the scope of Acts where they're referenced as well. So as we pick up in Acts chapter 18, it says, "After this, Paul left Athens, and he went to the city of Corinth. And when he got there, he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. They had been forced to leave Rome because the Emperor Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. And we have historical references to that indicate that it is most likely because of the spread of Christianity in Rome and the ruckus that it was causing. And of course, from an early Roman perspective, Christianity is just a subsect of what? Of Judaism, right? This is a Jewish thing that's happening. And so he ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Priscilla and Aquila leave Rome, and for whatever reason, they find themselves in the city of Corinth. Paul meets up with them when he gets to that city. Seems like they're already believers, and they have one other very important thing in common, which is they share the same trade. They were tent makers by trade. And so Paul is able to stay with them, practice his trade of tent making, and use that as kind of a base of operations as he spreads the gospel in Corinth. Now, this is something about Paul we haven't spent a lot of time talking about, and we're going to talk about it more in just a moment, but the idea that Paul had a trade beyond being a traveling evangelist. He had a job, and that job was used to support himself when necessary, and that job was a tent maker, making tents and awnings for people. So he meets up with Priscilla and Aquila. Just some things about Priscilla and Aquila that are important to know. We're going to read more about them actually next week in the city of Ephesus, and an important role that they play in helping a man named Apollos to learn the gospel more clearly. But when Paul writes his letter to the church in Corinthians that we know as 1 Corinthians chapter 16, he said, "The churches in the province of Asia send you greetings. Aquila and Priscilla greet you warmly in the Lord, and so does the church that meets in their house." So that they were all over the place. They had come from Rome. They're now in Corinth. Eventually they're going to go to Ephesus, where there's going to be a church that meets in their home. So they are hosts of a house church in the city of Ephesus, and that's where Paul sends his greetings from as he writes to Corinth later on. Also, when you look at the end of the book of Romans, and if you want an indication of how many people helped Paul along the way in his missionary efforts, Read Romans chapter 16 and just take note of how many people Paul calls out by name. Paul is not a superhero. He's just a man called to do the work of the Lord, and he relied on a lot of people to help him along the way. But these are the first names he mentions. In verses 3 and 5, he says, "Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ Jesus." And then listen to what he says. "They risked their lives for me." He doesn't elaborate. We don't know exactly what the backstory is. Probably happened in Ephesus. We know Paul is going to meet some serious opposition in Ephesus. But these are people that Paul could count on. How much had they done for Paul? They put their lives at risk in order to help him in the spread of the gospel. And he says, not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them. I just want you to see how important people like Priscilla and Aquila are. Just because the New Testament doesn't spend a lot of time detailing what they did doesn't mean they're not busy at work, as were so many other people that God is at work through at the time. And then again, he says, greet also the church that meets in their house. So eventually, they made it all the way back to Rome, and now they're hosting a house church in the city of Rome. And so God was at work through this couple all over the place. We'll go on there into verses 4 through 8. So Paul finds a place to work out of. He finds cohorts to work with in Priscilla and Aquila. Now he's able to focus his attention on the work at hand, which is the preaching of the gospel. And so picking up in verse 4, it says, every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Now this is right along the lines of what Paul does in every city he goes to, right? If he finds a synagogue, that's where he begins preaching. And like we've talked about, as a rabbi, he would have been giving an invitation to preach and teach. And so Paul used that to his advantage. You got an audience here in the city of Corinth, a Roman city, where the people meeting in the synagogue every Saturday aren't just Jews, but they're Gentiles as well. And so he's got a great audience for the preaching of the gospel. But he's doing this on the Sabbath. Now, there's two things to note here. Number one, that's because when they were meeting in the synagogue was on the Sabbath, on Saturday, but also because Paul is supporting himself. And so the indication here and the implication is that throughout the week, he's doing what? He's making tents alongside his new friends, Priscilla and Aquila, in order to support himself, which means this is really the only day he has to fully focus on the preaching ministry. But something is about to change. It says in the next verse, when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia. So if you recall, Paul had left Silas and Timothy in Macedonia, and he went to Athens by himself. So now he gets to Corinth. This is the first time he's meeting up with those men again. And when they come, something changes in the way Paul is able to approach his preaching ministry. It says, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. The indication is he's no longer having to spend all of his time making tents. Something has changed so that he can focus entirely on preaching. Well, what happened? With the coming of Silas and Timothy, something important happened, and we find a reference to that in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. In verses 7 through 9 there, Paul writes, was it a sin for me to lower myself in order to elevate you by preaching the gospel of God to you free of charge? What is he talking about? He goes on, he says, I robbed other churches by receiving support from them so as to serve you. Now, out of context, this sounds like weird language from Paul, but if you read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul is making a defense of his apostleship. And so he's saying some things that sound ridiculous, but it's on purpose. He says, I robbed other churches. He didn't really steal from other churches, understand. He's just saying, I was able to focus on my preaching there without asking you for support because other churches were supporting me at that time. And it says this, and when I was with you and needed something, I was not a burden to anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied what I needed. So putting the puzzle pieces together, what happened when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia? They brought with them financial support from the churches there so that Paul didn't have to make tents exclusively. He could live off of that support and focus himself entirely on preaching the gospel. He says, I have kept myself from being a burden to you in any way and will continue to do so. And I just want to share this because it gives some insight into the mindset of Paul as he was preaching. Sometimes he had no problem accepting support from churches so that he could focus entirely on preaching. Other times he supported himself, and it seems like he used the wisdom available to him to make a judgment call regarding when it was appropriate to do either or the other. If you look at Philippians chapter 4 and writing to the church in Philippi. Where was Philippi located, by the way? Macedonia. It's one of those Macedonian churches that helped Paul. He says, "Yet it was good of you to share in my troubles." Paul is writing the letter of Philippians mostly as a thank you to the church in Philippi for the financial support that they were giving him. He says, "Moreover, as you Philippians know, in the early days of your acquaintance with the gospel, when I set out from Macedonia, when I left you to continue preaching, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving except you only. For even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent me aid more than once when I was in need." And so generous churches like Philippi are able to support Paul financially so that when he gets to a place like Corinth, he can focus himself on preaching without having to ask that new church for help. Isn't it interesting just how the generosity of churches helped to fund all of this effort? And again, I just want to show you how many people actually were at work behind the scenes in making sure that Paul could do the work that God had called him to. And then again in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, in this context, Paul is making an argument, basically saying, look, I have a right to earn my living from preaching the gospel. But he tells them, I did not exercise that right. He says, if we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much that we reap a material harvest from you? If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? But we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. For whatever reason, Paul thought it best not to get support from the Christians in Corinth because he thought it would be a hindrance for some reason. And so he was able to preach full time because other churches were supporting him along the way. So I just want you to see how much is going on behind the scenes. Now we get back to our text. One of my favorite anecdotes in all of Paul's journeys in the book of Acts is found right here in chapter 18. It says, when they opposed Paul, so what happens is he spends several weeks preaching in the synagogue, then he's able to preach full time, and eventually opposition builds up, primarily among his Jewish audience, and they start to kind of hurl abuse at Paul and try to find a way to discredit him. And it says when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, this is the crowd at the synagogue, your blood be on your own heads, I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. And he doesn't mean like I've got no time for the Jewish people anymore. He's just saying, in this city, I'm not spending my time focused entirely on the synagogue anymore. I'm going to go out into the town and I'm going to get to work. But here's my favorite part. Okay, so Paul says, I'm done with the synagogue. I'm leaving. Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. If you close your eyes and you just allow yourself to envision the drama unfolding in that moment where Paul packs up and he walks across the street and he sets up shop there. And you just imagine like every Sabbath now when those people who can't stand Paul are filing into the synagogue for Sabbath worship, who are they seeing? I imagine him like sitting in a rocking chair on the front porch, nodding his head at them as they walk by. Right? It tells you so much about Paul, right? Just right across the street is where he sets up shop. With the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God, so now he's got a new place to operate. He didn't go across town, he went across the street. And that's where he gets to work. And then, what is God actually doing through Paul in this moment? How effective is this ministry, even though he's facing opposition from within the synagogue? Well, listen to this. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, and his entire household believed in the Lord. And many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. It's amazing, but is it surprising in any way? If you've been going through this journey with us through Acts, is it surprising that God is doing things like this through Paul? No. He continues to do the most surprising things, but when you read it, it becomes unsurprising because this is what God does. He does profound things in profound ways in the most unlikely of circumstances. Paul has to leave the synagogue because of opposition, but who is converted? The leader of the synagogue himself. God is doing amazing work through Paul. Paul's just a servant. He's not a superhero in the story. He's just a servant. This is God at work through his Spirit in the name of his Son Jesus. But the work continues, and God continues to grow his kingdom. So even the leader of the synagogue now and his entire family are baptized believers of the Lord. And you can imagine, though, the result of that is even greater opposition against Paul. If they were mad at him in the synagogue already, now they took the president. They're even more angry at this point in time. So then we get to verses 9 and 11 when something really beautiful happens. Luke doesn't dedicate a lot of text to it, but Paul receives a vision in the night from the Lord. Jesus appears to him and he has a message for Paul. One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you because I have many people in this city. And so Paul does something he's not done yet. He stays a long time in one place. Paul stayed in Corinth for a year and a half, teaching them the Word of God. And I want you to think about this message that Jesus gives to Paul. And before we think about this more critically, just ask this question of yourself. Have you ever been discouraged when it comes to the work of the kingdom? Have you ever felt discouraged in your faith and your walk with Christ? Have you ever felt like there's too much opposition stacked against you and it kind of causes you to lose steam and you're not pressing forward in the work anymore? Everybody feels like that. Sometimes you get stuck in that place, but we all feel it from time to time depending on what we're experiencing in life. Think about the beauty of the message Jesus shares with Paul. Break it down. 5 things he says specifically. Don't be afraid. Don't let fear overcome you. It's a message God was fond of giving his servants in the Old Testament, wasn't it? Don't be afraid. That's always followed up with something else important we'll see in just a minute, but don't be afraid. If we allow fear to rule us, then we become paralyzed by fear and we don't do anything anymore. Remember what Jesus told the apostles when he was sending them out? Don't be afraid of those who can destroy your body. Be afraid of whom? The one who can destroy both body and soul in hell. Don't be afraid of the people persecuting you. Have fear of God. Don't be afraid of people. They can't do anything. The things that we're afraid of people doing to us don't really matter in the long run anyway. Don't be afraid. Number 2, overcome that fear and then do what? Keep speaking and don't be silent. When we allow fear to rule us, we become very quiet, don't we? In those moments where you become discouraged in your faith, what happens? You stop sharing your faith as much, don't you? Don't be silent. Be even more bold in what you're proclaiming because, and this is again what God has told his servants throughout history, don't be afraid because I am with you. If God is for us, who can be against us? Romans chapter 8. You know, that's the passage that the earliest Bible verse I remember in my life is that verse. I don't remember, it was 2nd or 3rd grade. I had a project to do at school. And all I remember is spending the whole week with my mom. I drew a giant globe and I wrote that passage down there. As a child, trying to come to terms with my faith and what my relationship with God empowered me to do, for some reason that verse stuck out and I clung to it with all my heart. If God is for us, who can be against us? And this is the message Jesus is sharing with Paul. I am with you. There's no reason to fear or be silent because I am with you. How much would you like to hear that message from your God right now? In those moments where your faith seems small and the fear that you have of whatever is choking out any desire you have to be loud and to be boisterous. In those moments, wouldn't you love to just have a vision from Jesus saying, don't be afraid, I am with you? Well, he has. Romans chapter 8. God is for us, who can be against us? Number 4, no one will harm you. Paul's saying, I'm gonna let you be at work here in peace for once, Paul. You faced a lot of opposition, but here in Corinth, no one's going to lay a finger on you. So get to work. And number 5, and this is maybe the most important one. I have many people in this city. This is important because this is what happens when we lose our enthusiasm and our zeal and we give in to discouragement. We start to be quiet. We start to look inward. We stop being active. And then the way we justify it is we say, well, there's nobody here that wants to hear about God anyway. And so I might as well just stop working. And God is taking that excuse away from Paul. Don't stop working because I have many people in this city. And every Sunday, I'm blown away by the fact that God continues to send us visitors. He just sends them to us. People are searching all over right now, so we can grow discouraged and say, oh, the church can't grow because nobody wants God anymore. I don't buy it. There are people all over this city looking for God. And so I just want to encourage you to think about this message Jesus shared with Paul. Don't be afraid. Don't be silent. I am with you. No one will harm you. I have many people in this city. Don't lose heart. Let's get to work. And then what happens is, as this opposition builds against Paul, it comes to a head in an actual case that's brought against Paul. So the Jews from the synagogue bring a case against Paul to the Roman governor, a man named Gallio. And this is what happens. It says, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, so governor, think Pilate, okay, he's the highest form of authority actually in that city. The Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him to the place of judgment. This man, they charged, is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. Now you think about the opposition Paul has faced in Acts along the way and what we've seen him endure. He has faced opposition from a Jewish audience and opposition from a Roman audience. And this is not the first time that he's had to answer in front of some form of authority for what he's doing. We saw it last week in the Areopagus when they took him there as a way to kind of put him on trial. We don't like what this guy's talking about. We need to put a stop to this. And the same thing is happening here. So the Jews have this idea, if we bring him in front of Gallio, who had just come to power, it seems, at this point in time, maybe we can get the ear of this new governor and he'll put an end to this preaching once and for all. Maybe this is our legal way to overcome the influence that Paul is having on our community. And so they bring this charge against him. This man is persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. Now there is the catch. Contrary to the law. Well, what law do you think they have in mind? Well, they're trying to approach the Roman governor, so they're trying to convince him this is a threat to Roman law. But what we'll see is he's not about to buy it. By the way, this is an important historical moment in the book of Acts. It helps us date all of this conclusively. This is what's commonly referred to as the Delphi inscription, found at Delphi. It's an inscription in stone. The Emperor Claudius, a message recorded there in stone indicating that Gallio was the proconsul of Achaia. And it helps us date all of this. He was the proconsul of Achaia in 51 and 52 AD. And so if this is around the time where when Gallio took office, and that's why they're bringing Paul in front of him, then it helps us know that Paul is in Corinth when we're reading right now is around 51 AD. Just helps you kind of put that puzzle of the timeline of Paul all together. So just an interesting thing from history there. But it says, just as Paul was about to speak, so Paul's ready to give a defense of himself, just like he did back in Acts chapter 17. And what we're about to find is he doesn't even need to, because Jesus was right. He's going to grant Paul some peace here. This is what happens. Gallio said to them, if you Jews were making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it would be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names and your own law, in other words, this has got nothing to do with Roman law. You're just talking about your law. You're talking about Jewish stuff. Settle the matter yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things. And so he shoos them away. That's it. That's the final word on the matter. You're not going to find sympathy with me. I am not going to rule on this matter. This is an internal Jewish matter. You guys deal with it yourselves. Unsatisfied with that, it says the crowd turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue leader, and beat him in front of the proconsul. Why? You tell me. I have no idea. People do crazy things when they don't get their way, right? And Gallio showed no concern whatsoever. In other words, I'm not going to deal with this. You guys deal with it. And so it frees Paul, like we said, to work in Corinth for a period of time that he had never spent in another place before, save Antioch at the beginning. Gallio refuses to get involved in what he sees as purely a Jewish matter. This doesn't concern me in my position as a Roman authority. This is an internal matter with your synagogue. But that paves the way for the church in Corinth to grow, listen to me, without concern of government interference or outside persecution. The two things that Paul has faced the most, and I would suggest to you the two things that even the modern church is most afraid of. What are we most afraid of in this world? Government interference, outside persecution. We spend a lot of time talking about how to avoid those things, and sometimes, frankly, making some really silly decisions aligning ourselves with worldly powers in order to avoid these things. We're terrified of these things. This is what is at work against us that we're most afraid of, okay? But God has given Paul a moment here where he is free from both of these concerns. Did this guarantee that the church in Corinth would flourish and thrive? Okay, we've got 2 letters recorded for us in the New Testament that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth. We know more about the church in Corinth probably than we know about any other first century church. And what we know about them is enlightening. When you read 1 Corinthians, Paul's letter to the church in Corinth there, he makes it clear that they had their fair share of problems. Anybody familiar with the book of 1 Corinthians? Is the church in Corinth the kind of church that you would hope to be one day? Oftentimes we look at Corinth and we're like, okay, here's a textbook for everything not to do as a church. That's probably not fair to them, but they struggled with a lot of stuff. But here's my question, where did those problems come from? Were they external problems? In other words, was the problem in the church in Corinth that they were facing outside persecution and opposition? And the answer is no. You look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1 right away. Listen to what Paul says. He says, I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree with one another in what you say, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly united in mind and thought. Now, why does he even have to write that to them? Because, my brothers and sisters, some from Chloe's household, probably the church where they met, have informed me that there are quarrels among you. Well, every church has quarrels, right? You don't get along with everybody all the time, and disagreements come and go. That happens. But when you survey the letter of 1 Corinthians and you find out the kind of things they were fighting over, makes your eyes open wide. Sexual immorality, Paul says, not even named among the Gentiles. A man has his father's wife in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. What in the world is that about? 1 Corinthians 6, they're taking each other to court and suing each other. This isn't an argument at the potluck on Sunday afternoon. This is a big deal in the church. Suing each other, and Paul takes them to task. How dare you go to secular courts? You guys can't figure out how to solve this amongst yourselves? You get to chapter 11, he turns his attention to the Lord's Supper, and he chastises them again, and he says, it's not even the Lord's Supper that you're taking. Some people get full, some people get hungry, some people get drunk at the Lord's Supper. This is what's going on in the church in Corinth. They even found a way to pick fights with each other over who had the best spiritual gifts. But all of this is coming from where? It's coming from inside the church. That's what you need to understand. All right, Paisley and Jeff, you're not allowed to answer this question. Anybody know who this guy is? Bonus points if you do. This is Tadej Pogačar. You should know who this is. Come on, guys. Get with the program. Tadej Pogačar is a Slovenian cyclist. How many of you even know where Slovenia is? Okay. Tadej Pogačar is like the Michael Jordan of riding a bike. Already, as a young man in his mid-20s, probably, maybe the greatest cyclist to ever ride. Maybe will be one day at least. Just won his 4th Tour de France a few weeks ago. I love cycling. Been a part of my life for 20 plus years now. I'm very passionate about it. Sometimes I don't get time to do it like I would like, but I love it. I've worked in bike shops. I've helped lead race teams. I did some racing in the past. I try to get my daughter to ride her bike whenever I can talk her into it. I love cycling. And so I've watched the Tour de France faithfully for decades now. It's one of the most exciting times to watch it right now. So those of you wondering, wouldn't it be fun to watch a bunch of guys in Lycra ride across France for 3 weeks? Yes, I'll tell you all about it. Jeff, you can help me out with this, right, buddy? There you go. All right, so the reason I bring Tadej up is because there's a huge number of recreational cyclists all over the world, and especially in our country. You guys see them all the time on Southern California roads because you hate them, you honk at them, you yell at them, you put their lives in danger. Stop doing that. Anyway, you see these guys on the road, right? And I'm sure you've thought to yourselves before, why is that man wearing those clothes? Here's the thing. There's this psychology that happens as humans sometimes, and we don't even realize we're doing it, and it's hard to overcome, but it's this. Okay, let's say I want to get into cycling, and I want to become the fastest bike rider on the Santa Ana River Trail on Saturday mornings. I'm going to go to the bike shop, and I'm going to say, okay, sell me a bike. And then I'm going to look at the prices on the bike, and I'm going to go, oh my. There's a big difference in the prices of bikes. This is the bike that Tade won his 4th tour on just a few weeks ago. Beautiful bike by Colnago. You want to buy Tade's bike? $18,000. 18 grand. Now why? Because it's more aerodynamic and it's lighter than most bikes you can buy. This is why it costs so much. Now, if you are Tadej Pogačar winning your 4th Tour de France, every gram you can save matters when you're riding up to these mountains. Every bit of aerodynamic efficiency matters when you're racing against all these other people. But if you are just riding on Saturday mornings on a bike path, does that stuff matter? No. And yet, you see a lot of guys on the bike path on Saturday morning with $15,000, $18,000 bikes. Why? Something about our psychology makes us think that if I buy his bike, I can ride my bike like him, right? And I will gladly fork out thousands of dollars to save 100 grams over this cheap, useless bike. Imagine how much faster I'll be. Well, I saved 100 grams. Now I want you to think about this psychology, right? If I were to do that, I would first have to acknowledge, and this is what we don't like to do as humans, that the problem is not the bike. It's not the bike. The reason I'm not faster than everybody else on the bike path is not the bike. And even if I bought Tadej's bike and saved 100 grams, I'm still not going to be that fast because the thing slowing me down is not the weight of the bike. Anybody want to guess what it is? It's the weight of the belly. And it's not the shape of the bike, it's the shape of this body. I am not cutting through the wind like a hot knife through butter. I'm not doing that right now the way I'm shaped. So it would be ridiculous for me to do that, right? But we still do it. And I go to a bike shop, guess which bike I'm looking at? I'm looking at that one. It's like buying an F1 car to go get groceries on Saturday morning. It makes no sense. But there's something about the way we think that causes us to struggle with this. And what does that have to do with what we're talking about this morning? Everything. Because this is what we do in the church so often. We say, oh man, if God would just grant us the perfect environment where we had no opposition, no persecution, the government would just leave us alone and we could get along on with our business, we would be the fastest growing church in history. Because it's never about us, is it? It's always about outside forces working against us. It's not my body that's slowing me down, it's the bike. It's not us that's the problem, it's everybody working against us that's the problem. And if things would just be perfect, then the church would grow. And yet that's not what we read in Scripture, is it? We read about a church in Acts that is exploding in numbers, in zeal, in influence, even when everything is stacked against it. And here in Corinth, even when the government says, we're not going to interfere in this, just do what you want to do, and Paul is given a path to true freedom as he spreads the gospel, it doesn't mean that the church in Corinth was perfect as a result, does it? That's not how it works. I want to remind you, as we have before, that if you're just sitting around waiting for everything outside to become perfect so that everything inside can reflect it, you're neglecting one very important fact, that the God that we serve, does not rely on outside influences in order to do His will. God will carry out His will no matter what. Remember Philippi? The Philippian jailer and his family came to Christ when Paul was where? In prison. Throw us in prison, the kingdom will grow. Threaten us, the kingdom will grow. Tell us we have to remain silent, the kingdom will grow. How do I know this? Because that's what happened in Acts. And it continues to happen all over the world today. Trust in the God who empowers you. And then as we wrap this passage up, chapter 18 through 22, this kind of brings Paul's second missionary journey to a close. It says, Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. So they go with him. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchrea because of a vow he had taken. They arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. He himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews, and when they asked him to spend more time with them, he declined. But as he left, he promised, I will come back if it is God's will. And Paul will come back. We'll talk about that in chapter 19. Then he set sail from Ephesus, He lands at Caesarea on the coast. He goes up to Jerusalem, greets the church there, and then he goes down to the church in Antioch, the church that he had this great relationship with that continued to send him out on these missionary journeys. And so after those several years preaching the gospel through places like Macedonia and Achaia, Paul returns back to Antioch to share with them what God's been doing. And we're going to see him go out now on his third missionary journey when we pick up next week.
When we walk with the Lord in the light of His Word, what a glory He sheds on our way. While we do His good will, He abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Not a shadow can rise, not a cloud in the skies, but a smile quickly drives it away. Not a doubt nor a fear, not a sigh nor a tear can abide while